Hi, in this video we are going to wrap up the discussion on competitive positioning that we began 2 weeks ago with our discussion of Trader Joe's and completed this week in the context of Husky. So we're going to begin with an introduction of what we mean by competitive position, as again we talked about with our Trader Joe's analysis and as we illuminated with the ratio analysis that we did with Trader Joe's and the introduction of value creation and capture, which we'll talk about today. As you can see here, we are in Module 3 of the first section of the class on analyzing and selecting competitive positioning. Okay, so how do we think about competitive positions? So in the first week of the class, as I've mentioned many times, I showed two slides. One slide shows that there's wide differences in the performance across industries. So we can see this on the left side of the slide here, where there's 3 different industries, pharmaceuticals, computers, and airlines, with wildly different performance. But on the next slide that I showed in the first week of class, which you can see here on the right side of the graph, is that within industries, there's actually even greater differences in the performance of firms. So the variation across industries is actually dwarfed by the variation of performance by firms within industries. And we can see this here within airlines. So airlines on the left side of the slide is a poorly performing industry on average. But on the right side of the slide, we can see here that actually within airlines, there are some firms that are performing outstandingly well, Delta and Southwest as 2, and then other firms, United is one that sticks out here that's actually performing terribly. So even within a terrible industry on average, you can actually do quite well. And so that's the part that we're going to dig into more in this set of slides, which is how do you select a position within an industry to do well? And how do you think about that position in terms of value that's created by the firm and value that's capturable by the firm? So in general, as we've talked about throughout the class, sustainable competitive advantage is the ability of a firm to be more profitable than its competitors in the long run. You do this through 2 halves. The first half is what position you select. Is the position that I as a firm am in my industry, is that position going to allow me to both create value and capture value? In general, looking at the left side of the slide here, there's 3 types of these textbook strategic positions that we've talked about. Cost-based position, a benefits-based position, and a differentiated position. On the right side of the slide, we ask how sustainable is that position over the long run? So you need to have a position that will enable you to create and capture value and one that's defensible in the long run. And that's what we mean when we say firms can select a position within an industry that can allow them to create value, even if on average that industry itself is not doing well. One note before we get into the rest of the slide. This is more of a disclaimer for those of you that paid attention during our Trader Joe's analysis to all the different performance metrics and are trying to tie that to what you may have seen in corporate finance class or in accounting classes, etc. So there are many measures of profitability. I put 5 here on the slide, but there's many more. So common ones that we've talked about, so return on equity, return on assets, these are 2 that are part of the DuPont analysis that we brought up in Trader Joe's. There's other ones that come up often. You'll see what's called economic value added, EVA, or economic profit. You'll see that a lot in consulting, for instance. Return on invested capital, you'll also see a lot in consulting, or just plain stock performance, the excess stock returns that a firm earns over a benchmark. Whether that benchmark is the S&P 500 or firms in the industry or whatnot. These are all very valid performance returns, and they're all different from each other. For the rest of this class, we are going to leave these behind, and we're going to abstract away by looking at performance more from an economics point of view, and where we say a firm is able to create value and capture it if their price is greater than their cost and if their price has to be less than its willingness to pay. And in general, that's an economics viewpoint of performance, and it ought to map to these accounting and finance measures. We're not going to take the extra step to do it for most of this class, but you should be able to satisfy yourself offline that if you can create an economic profit, it should be translatable to accounting or financial returns. The reason why I'm pointing this out in these slides is because we did do the DuPont analysis, which had these two performance metrics, return on equity and return on assets, and that's extremely useful for analyzing position. For the rest of the class, we're going to focus on willingness to pay, price, and cost. Okay. So now moving on to the value creation and value capture framework. Okay, this is a simplified way of understanding how strategic decisions that firms make can be linked to economic outcomes. So let me just introduce the schematics because we're going to come back to them later on in these slides and during the rest of the course. Okay, so on the x-axis here we have units sold, that is over here, and on the y-axis here we have average cost per unit. So how do we think about the value that a firm creates and the value that it captures? Okay, so on average, the number of units that a firm sold can be thought of as this distance here between 0 and whatever the total units a firm creates, and the average cost that that you can produce those units can be thought of as C, the sum line here on this graph. Okay, so this green rectangle here is the cost of production for that firm. Now, up here, we have willingness to pay. This is the benefit of a product to a customer. That is the customer's willingness to pay just at the point of indifference between buying the product and walking away from the product. So any price below this willingness to pay, presumably a customer is willing to pay for a product. Any price above it, they're not. So this big blue square here represents the value created by a firm. Okay. Now, how is that value divided? So this blue box is the value creation piece of it. Now we're asking about the capture piece. So somewhere between cost and willingness to pay, price is set. At that level that price is set, we split the surplus. Everything that's above that goes to the consumer as a surplus, and everything that is below that line goes to the firm as profits. Okay, so that, again, the blue area is the value created, and as long as price is above cost, the firm can capture some of that in terms of profits, and as long as price is somewhere below willingness to pay, the consumer gets some benefit from purchasing the product. Okay, so there is our framework here. Now let's think about sources of competitive advantage. So let's think about these three textbook strategies here. The first source of competitive advantage can be if a firm decreases costs relative to its competitor. So this is considered a cost-based advantage. Another source of competitive advantage is if a firm can increase either the benefits relative to its competitor or find a differentiation-based advantage. Now let's walk through each of these using this framework so we understand what we're talking about here. Okay, cost-based advantage. So a cost-based competitive advantage works if the amount by which you reduce your price, see the old price is this gray P here, you're reducing your price to a lower price, given that you actually are reducing the benefits that you're creating, so presumably you're offering a lower price and you're not giving as much to the consumer as a result, is less than the amount by which you have reduced your costs. Because in this case, you've actually increased your profits. So what do we mean here? You're a company and you want to have a cost-based advantage. You're going to offer your services at a far lower cost. You're going to produce your goods at a much lower cost than your competitors. You're going to sell it at a lower price, but the customer is going to get some benefit because the amount that you've reduced your price is actually more than the amount that their benefits have been reduced. So they're willing to buy the product for that reason here, and you're able to capture value because you've reduced your costs more than you've reduced your prices. So everybody wins in this scenario. Okay, so what are some sources of cost-based advantages? So there are several. They all tend to be productivity-based cost drivers. So things like economies of scale, economies of scope, which we've talked about, bulk purchasing, which we've talked about, making sure that your capacity is utilized, all of these are variants of each other, right? Specialization, so process specialization. So I am creating a product and I'm so good at creating that product that my process is more efficient than everybody else. That can also be a source of cost-based advantage. Cost drivers related to cumulative experience. So there's something called a learning curve, which you may have heard of. This is actually something that can be mapped out quantitatively. And the general idea here is that the 100th unit that I produce is cheaper for me to produce than the first unit that I produced, not because of any economies of scale, but because I'm just better at it. I've learned how to do it. I make fewer mistakes. I use my materials more efficiently. That's a learning curve. Okay. There's also cost drivers related to the organization of transactions. So there are situations in which vertical integration enables closer coordination that allows you to produce things at lower cost. Alternatively, there's situations in which contracting allows you to produce things at lower cost. So, or the organization of the transactions can enable you to have cost-based advantage under different conditions. Okay. Similarly, technology, you're just simply more productive. Because of automation, processes, coordination, etc. Again, these are not independent of each other, but this gives you a sense of some categories of where you can derive some cost-based advantages. Okay, moving on to the next, a benefits-based advantage. A benefits-based advantage works if the amount by which you're increasing price, so now we're increasing the price, we're producing a premium product, given that we're increasing the benefits, so premium product, which means that consumers are getting more or customers are getting more, and so as a result they're willing to pay more, is more than the amount by which I've increased my cost. This gives me an advantage. So I'm producing a better product, but the amount that I'm producing the better product, I have not passed on all those as cost to my producers. Okay, so here the distance between the C and the P here is bigger than it used to be between the gray C and the gray P. I am creating value, and because that wedge is bigger, I'm able to capture that value and benefits to me. Okay. In this case, I'm able to increase my profits and thereby capture some value. Okay. So what are some sources of benefits-based advantages? So here I just need to be better. Okay, that's a benefits-based advantage. Whatever my product is, everybody agrees that it's better. So performance, durability, aesthetics, yada, 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 service, etc., etc. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide because this hardly ever occurs. You almost never see this. You might see this with, a massive shift in technology or a massive shift in the ability to produce things in a better way, but I am hard pressed to come up with a source of benefits-based advantages that actually occur in real life. Generally, we get the third kind, which is a focused advantage or a differentiation-based advantage. So what do I mean by this? The value creation looks very similar to the prior slide, where you've raised willingness to pay, you've raised prices more than you've raised costs, but only for a specific segment of the customers. Okay, so here's a situation where, as it says in the title, if customers differ in their preferences, firms can have a competitive advantage by serving a segment. This is what we saw in Husky and what we saw to some extent in Trader Joe's, although Trader Joe's has a very peculiar both focused and cost-based position, as we talked about in class. Okay, so let's think about these different preferences. For many products, customers do not agree about what makes quality product. So there's PC people, there's Mac people. There's reasons to think that one does not necessarily dominate the other under all conditions to all people. Similarly, taste-based preferences in music, in books, etc. Beyonce or Beethoven, right? That just gives one stark example. Okay, so for these products, firms have a competitive advantage if they serve one of these segments particularly well. Again, this is precisely what we saw with Husky. In order to be successful at this strategy, a firm has to differentiate on attributes that customers really care about and have a large enough niche or segment to justify the entry costs and to be able to do it at a low enough cost, given that they have to produce a premium product and charge higher prices. Okay, so this is a differentiation-based advantage, or what we call a differentiation strategy. Okay, and again, this is classic what we saw with Husky. So, takeaways on this general framework. Here it is. You have a wedge between willingness to pay and cost. Your price is somewhere in between, and this is the value created, and everything below this line here is the value captured by the firm. Okay. A product or service must provide benefits to the end users in order to create value, and a firm has to first create value in order to capture any of it. Okay? Creating value does not guarantee profits. So we're going to see this in the next set of slides. A firm must be able to capture some of that value by having a larger wedge than the competition, meaning that you either have to be able to provide more benefits to the consumers in terms of a premium product or raised willingness to pay, even if it's to some segment of customers, or be able to offer it at a lower cost. But you have to do something different than your competition. If you don't do something different along one of these dimensions, at least one of these dimensions from your competition, then you're not going to capture any value. And that's the bottom line of this framework. Okay. On to the next. Now we're going to talk specifically about how to apply this framework. This is Module 4. This is the end of our Husky discussion, and now we're wrapping up our discussion of competitive positioning. So now where are we here? We are at the end of this first segment on competitive positions. After this, we're going to move on to competitive dynamics, using some of these concepts to figure out how firms in relatively different positions now compete against each other directly. But right now, we're going to focus on thinking about value creation and value capture once you're in a position. Okay, so Module 4, there's 3 constructs that we're going to talk about in the next set of slides. One is actual quantification of both willingness to pay and cost, and then the last is starting to introduce the next segment, which is on conditional on being in a differentiated position. How do we think about competition between firms? Okay, lovely. Here is our example. Value creation and value capture, one firm in an industry. Okay. Here we have a wedge. This 7 here is the willingness to pay of a firm for a particular product. Okay, so let's imagine that if there's one firm in an industry and they offer one product and the consumer willingness to pay for that product is 7. Okay, they are able to produce that product at $4. Okay, so there's a gap of $3 between 7 and 4 that this firm is positioned within this industry. Now, if there's only one firm in this industry, what happens to prices and what happens to profit? Pause this video and I want you to think about it in your head. What are prices and profits? And then resume it again. Okay, so if there's only one firm and there's no competition, guess what? Price is going to be right at willingness to pay. The firm will be able to set their prices right at the consumer indifference point between walking away or not. The firm gets $3 of profits and consumers or customers get 0 because the firms have all the power, and as long as the price is, let's say, 6.999999999, the consumer is willing to pay for it because they'll be epsilon better, just a little bit better than they would be walking away. Okay, so that's called monopoly power. That's great for that firm. Moving on. 2 firms. Now let's imagine we're in a situation where instead of there being only one show in town, there's 2. And they do the exact same thing. So they both produce the same product where consumers have the same willingness to pay for it and they can produce it at the same cost. Now what happens to prices? Pause the video and think about where you think prices are going to go. Okay, well, let's imagine they first start out at 7, but both of these firms are saying, well, if I undercut the other one by just a little bit, then I can grab the market. And then the other firm says, well, I'm going to undercut that firm by a little bit and grab the market. And they compete and compete and compete all the way down until prices hit 4, because neither firm is offering anything additional to the consumers. So under this scenario, you have two identical firms that aren't doing anything special. Prices go to cost, the firms get no profits, and the consumers or customers get $3 of benefits from purchasing either of these two products. Okay, that's how competition benefits consumers. Now let's use this framework as a way of understanding Husky's competitive position. So let's imagine that Husky is in this market, and this is your generic injection molding competitor. This is pre-Netstal. This is where Husky was before the train kind of ran off the rails at the end of the case. So here there's their initial position. Customers are willing to pay a lot for Husky's goods because they get a lot out of it. This is the willingness to pay analysis that we just did. High durability, high throughput, low breakdowns, low electricity usage, low resin usage. You get the picture. So because of all of that, customers are willing to pay a lot. Let's say they're willing to pay 11 and only willing to pay 7 for the next best alternative. Okay? So if this is Husky's position, where are prices going to go? Again, pause the video. I want you to imagine where are prices going to be for Husky's machines. Okay. Well, you can imagine they start at 11 and they start at 8, and then these firms will compete them all the way down until this guy can't drop prices anymore, and this gap is 3, so prices here should go to 8. So as long as Husky's costs are below 8, let's imagine that it's 6 here, Husky will make a profit. Okay, so 0 goes to this firm. In this example, where I've arbitrarily chosen Husky's cost to be 6, Husky gets $2 of profit and $3 of benefit go to the consumer. Why do $3 of benefit go to the consumer? Because that is the gap between willingness to pay and cost of the next best customer, so that is the amount capturable by the consumer. So as long as Husky's wedge between willingness to pay and cost is greater than 3, Husky will be able to capture the difference between those two. That's the willingness to pay advantage that we talked about in class. Okay, now cost generally increases, willingness to pay increases. So it's unlikely that Husky's cost will be 4 unless they're just generally better than everybody else. But as long as they're less than 8, then Husky's in a good shape. So where are these costs coming from? So let's think about Husky again. So this is the higher level of service, the higher investment in employees, and the higher R&D that they spend, the fact that they spend a long time customizing these machines, not mass producing them, etc., etc. All of these things come together to increase costs, but presumably they also translate into higher benefits for the customer by making better machines. So again, as long as this gap, which here is 5, is greater than the gap here of 3 between the next best competitor, Husky will be able to capture the difference between the two. Okay, now let's think about Netstal. So the headline of this slide is Low Cost Entry Disrupts the Market. This is, as we talked about in class, this is just the same as Costco disrupting the supermarket market, the same dynamic as Netstal coming in and disrupting this market. So here let's imagine the market. Here's Husky and the next best competitor, and here comes Netstal. So I'm making this very stark, where I'm saying Netstal comes in as the low-cost producer. So let's imagine they can produce things at a very, very low cost. And let's imagine, just to be conservative, that the willingness to pay for Netstal machines is the same as the next best competitor. So they're not as good as Husky's machines, but man, they can produce them at a low cost. Okay, where do we think Husky's prices are going to go if Netstal enters? Again, pause the video and guess where prices, or figure out where prices are going to go. So we started at 8, and what happens to the market? So the first thing that happens to the market is this guy's out. This guy's out because having only a gap of between 7 and 4 of 3 is not enough benefits to the consumer to allow them to compete effectively in the market. Husky now looks at Netstal's prices, and they compete down until Husky can't drop prices anymore at 6. Okay, that's the gap. Husky has a gap of 5 between 11 and 6. They compete prices all the way down to 6. And now Netstal has a gap of 6 between 7 and 1. They compete prices all the way down to 2, and they capture the difference. Just like Husky captured the difference between their wedge and the next closest competitor, Netstal can now make up the difference between their low cost but also their low cost position. So their low prices to consumers and their low cost position. And Husky gets competed down. So this piece here just summarizes what we just discussed. So the customer gets the amount of value of the next closest competitor, which is now Husky, and Netstal gets 1. Okay. Excuse me. So customer is happy. What happens next? So now let's think about the two options that Husky considered, that we considered in class. So on the one hand, Husky can move up market and try to invest more in the machines and broaden their wedge this way by further increasing willingness to pay from 11 to 14 with a moderate cost increase, let's say of 6 to 7. So that's one option for them. The other option for them is what Shad called the Mercedes approach, which is the one that they eventually did, where they say, look, we're going to cut costs, we're going to streamline the organization, and we're going to offer a pretty good product, just maybe not as, the Ferrari of the industry. So here you can see willingness to pay dropped slightly from 11 to 8.5, and costs decrease now from 6 to 2. So both of these, by the framework that we just talked about, Husky ought to be able to capture some value, because here the gap in this wedge is 7, here it's 6.5, and here Netstal is 6. So they should be able to capture, in this case, $1 of value, and in this case, $0.50 of value relative to their next closest competitor. So how do they pick between the two? How do I think about this wedge versus this wedge? This position versus this position, vis-a-vis this low-cost entrant that's fundamentally disrupting the market. So which option should Husky choose? Now we're going to bring in quantity. So remember, from the value creation and value capture framework, there was two axes. This axis here, which was willingness to pay price and cost, and this axis here, which was quantity. So let's bring quantity into the picture. So on the one hand, if I go ultra Ferrari, for instance, I might be able to capture $1 worth of profits, but my market's not that great, right? There aren't a ton of companies that are potentially interested in a $14 willingness to pay type product, and as a result, I'm going to get squeezed. And you can imagine that the more Netstal invests, the better they get, the more this squeezing is going to happen. The closer this Q is going to get to 0. So that's one alternative. On the other hand, with the Mercedes approach, I might only get half a dollar's worth of profit here, but the market might be fundamentally bigger. So ultimately, one dimension of how I choose between these two positions is which blue area is greater for me. Okay, is this blue greater or is this blue greater? Because that's what I fundamentally care about. So that is the first consideration. Which market can I make more profits, aka have a greater blue rectangle? Now there's two other considerations that we have to think about that are more qualitative or more judgment oriented. So the second one, or the first of these two additional pieces, is which market is more defensible. This is a tough call. So on the one hand, this premium market could be very prone to getting squeezed by Netstal at this end, where this Q is going to get moving closer and closer to 0. So on that hand, it may seem not as defensible as one might hope. On the other hand, this market also might not be defensible in the sense that if Netstal massively increases their quality to 8.5 and has a lower cost position, I might not be in such a great position either. So that's an assessment that you'd have to make. The third assessment is which position is feasible. So remember, strategy is the sum total of a set of strategic choices that firms make to achieve a position. If I have to fundamentally undo many of my choices here, I might end up breaking my entire model rather than just moving from one position to another. So for instance, if I cut benefits, if I stop investing in employees, if I outsource my servicing, if I cut R&D, all to achieve this 2 position here, fundamentally I might break my company in the process of trying to get here. So this might be wishful thinking. And there may be similar considerations for this position here. So all 3 of these are major factors into deciding how to respond to a low-cost entrant. Okay. That sums up the value creation and value capture discussion in the context of Husky. Now I want to talk about the two fundamental tools that we've talked about in class so far, about how to calculate the top of the wedge, willingness to pay, and the bottom of the wedge, costs, because you have to understand both of those in order to calculate your value creation and value capture potential. So let's start with willingness to pay analysis. We're not going to spend a lot of time in this video on willingness to pay analysis. Why? Because you have a great reading on it. It's a beautiful reading. It gives you everything you need to know, and I'm just summarizing it here in the video. So my bottom line for these 2 slides is read the handout on willingness to pay. You will learn everything you'll need to know. The punchline of it is what we talked about with the Husky case, which is that the willingness to pay advantage that a firm has is the difference between the total cost of ownership of a competitor's product less the total cost of ownership of my product. And the key to a company like Husky is that the total cost of ownership of these products is only partly the capital cost of the products. If I provide a lot of benefits that lower the costs on the other sides of the operating costs from my customer's perspective, then I might still have a competitive advantage even if the capital cost of my good itself might be greater than my competitors. That's the essence of their differentiated position. So these costs have to include all the costs in the usage of the focal product, not just the cost of the machine itself, but all the other costs. So what can that cost include? So we did 4 of them in class. Remember, we did labor, resin, electricity, and floor space, but there can be other, like quality, like the amount of time it takes to educate your workforce, other disruptions to the operations, the lifetime of the machine, the durability of the machine, etc. So the ideal willingness to pay analysis accounts for all of these costs to come up with this calculation. Okay. So what are the steps? Again, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this because it's in your handout, but there are generally 4. You need to identify a unit of analysis to make your apples-to-apples comparison, identify all the inputs that go into your willingness to pay calculation, quantify those inputs, and are able to communicate those differences to the buyer. Okay, consumer markets. Way, way harder than the business analysis that we just did. So I'm going to defer the calculation of willingness to pay in consumer markets to your marketing classes, because this is incredibly tricky and more than one class's worth of discussion. Suffice it to say, there's many of them, they have many different preferences. It is challenging to aggregate those different preferences across many different consumers, so there's different techniques for doing it. Those techniques are summarized in your reading, okay? But some of those techniques are revealed preference. You look at what customers are willing to pay for the set of products out there, and you can run what's called these hedonic analyses around this to try to figure that out. You can run surveys to say, would you be willing to buy this product for X plus $1, for X plus $2, etc. Okay, this is very hard. There's also what's called discrete choice analysis. This is a nasty, complicated statistical analysis where you figure out customers' willingness to pay for attributes of your product. So you consider your product not as say a car, but that you consider that your car is a bundle of attributes. It's a combination of horsepower, of MPG, of styling, of comfort, of four-wheel drive ability, etc., etc. And then you figure out what their willingness to pay is for each of those attributes on their own. In practice, This is something that economics PhDs do for companies. GM has a whole floor of economics PhDs running these discrete choice analyses, so it's not something we can cover in a class, but that's the general idea. Okay, moving next to relative costs. Relative cost analysis. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on here because you have a beautiful handout that I've assigned on relative cost analysis that explains it. Okay, it is one of the most common tools for strategists along with willingness to pay analyses. Remember, to calculate the wedge, you need to know the willingness to pay on the top and the cost on the bottom. So you calculate the willingness to pay through willingness to pay analysis, and then you go down and you calculate your costs through relative cost analysis. That's why these are so fundamental, and we spend time on both of them. The goal is to estimate your company's costs relative to your rivals in order to do a whole bunch of things that, remember back to Ryanair, what we've talked about. Who has the overall cost advantage? How is a rival going to react to a price change? Will they cut their costs, or are they going to back away because they have a high cost position? How is a price war going to evolve? So what's their cost structure? What's the ratio of fixed costs to relative costs? Is my cost advantage real? Think Ryanair A versus Ryanair C. Ryanair A, their cost advantage was not sustainable. Ryanair C, it certainly was. Okay, and then you use it for a whole host of everyday type of activities. So how low can I go to win a contract? How low is my competitor going to go? Can we win this contract? Can we get this business? Can we serve this segment of customers? Can we reduce costs? If I have a cost structure of my competitor and I have mine, I can compare and benchmark and say, hey, why are their inputs so much cheaper than mine? Can I outsource? Can I change my suppliers? So there's a host of real reasons why I use this cost analysis for. Steps. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this in this video because you have a beautiful handout, as I've said on this, but there's generally 4. You figure out one standard line or product, so you have apples to apples comparison. You construct the baseline cost structure, so generally it's your own, even though in Ryanair it was British Airways, so sometimes it can be a competitor's, but generally you start with your own because you have better data for your own. And then you use cost drivers and differences with rivals to estimate the competitor cost structure. And then finally you conduct all your what-if experiments. Okay, these slides give you additional detail. You have the handout for them. They are all they do is summarize what's in the reading that you have. So I'm not going to spend time here, but here are the general steps. Okay, step 1 and step 2 are on this slide. Step 3 and step 4 are on this slide. Okay, some habits and mistakes of relative cost analysis that people do. So often you want to be able to triangulate your aggregate numbers with your bottom-up numbers to make sure that you're calculating your margins properly. They should tie. But you don't want to use consolidated financial statements. Why are consolidated financial statements bad for relative cost analysis? Because they mix up all kinds of stuff that shouldn't be mixed up. They mix geographies, they mix products, they mix pricing decisions, they mix category decisions. You cannot use standard financial statements and get good enough data and good enough categories to run these. So you need some kind of advantageous bottom-up or lower level data to run these analyses on. Okay. The third common pitfall that people make is not handling fixed and marginal costs properly. So remember back to Ryanair, people said, well, they have cheaper airline costs or aircraft costs because they're only running 44-seat turboprops. Well, that's true, but 44-seat turboprops only hold 44 passengers. So on a per passenger basis, it's unclear that it nets out to less money. Okay. So these are our 2 big quantitative tools that we've learned so far in the class. Relative cost analysis, which is one half of the picture, and willingness to pay is the other. You need both of them to map out the wedge. Finally, in this video, I'm going to introduce a model of differentiated competition. And the reason is because we've so far talked about what a differentiated position is, but we haven't thought about how 2 firms occupying 2 different differentiated positions compete against each other. And this is important to understand because it's going to introduce our next module on competitive dynamics. So let's use a very, very simple model of differentiated product competition. This is called the Hotelling line. This was invented by an economist, I believe in 1920, as a model of how we think about differentiated product competition. So let's think about it in the context of coffee shops. Let's imagine we have a street that's 2 miles long, and there's a set of people that live on this end of the street and a set of people that live on the other end of the street, and I'm trying to figure out where to locate my coffee shop. So here is the challenge, okay? All consumers are willing to pay $5 for coffee. So that's their willingness to pay for coffee. But they don't like walking. So if they have to walk a mile to get to the coffee shop, then they're only willing to pay $3 for that cup of coffee. So their implied travel cost per mile is $2. Okay, so they don't like traveling a distance for their coffee, so the further they walk, the less they're willing to pay for coffee. So if I enter right at mile 1, halfway between these two customers, I ask, what should Acme charge for a cup of coffee? The answer is $3, because that is their customer's willingness to pay once they walked the mile to get to my cup of coffee. Okay? So that's one coffee shop. Okay? Now let's add 2 coffee shops. Okay? Let's imagine 2 coffee shops enter, and they both unfortunately enter at exactly the same place, which is between these 2 sets of customers. Okay? Now, if they both are offering exactly the same cup of coffee at exactly 1 mile away from both sets of consumers, then what's going to happen to prices? Well, guess what? They're going to compete prices all the way down to marginal cost, to cost, which in this case we're saying is 50 cents per cup. So they're not going to get any benefits if they both are located here. But guess what? If one coffee shop locates close to this set of consumers and one coffee shop locates to this set of consumers, then they can make profits. Okay? So this set of consumers only incurs a 50-cent charge for walking a quarter mile to this coffee shop. So this guy can actually make money if he charges $4.50 per cup. And this guy, Acme 2, can do the same and only serve this set of customers. And these guys, $4.50 per cup is too much for these guys to compete and walk all the way over here. And likewise, $4.50 is too far for this set of consumers to walk all the way over here. So they've divided up the market and specialized by Acme 2 serving the customers at the 2-mile mark and Acme 1 serving the customers at the 1-mile mark. Okay. And what you can do to satisfy yourself is that $400 of profits, which is what they get by serving these customers, there's 100 customers, I should say, in each group, is greater profit than if they tried to lower prices all the way down and compete against each other and serve both of the markets. There we go. There's the math that you can do. Okay, so that is a simple differentiation model, and we're going to come back to that next week with Airbus. So some lessons. When products are undifferentiated, price competition is more intense. When the more differentiated you are, the higher prices you can charge, the bigger your margin, the greater your competitor's incentive and ability to lower price to steal your market. And it may be more profitable, as we just learned with the coffee shop example, to serve your niche and let your competitor to serve his niche rather than to try to sell to the whole market. So this geographic analogy that we just talked about in terms of coffee shop actually extends to many different contexts. And specifically, we can think about, instead of geography, we can think about attribute space and how companies think about launching products in attribute space. So let's imagine automobiles here, and let's imagine that there's only 2 attributes, big and small, and let's say sporty and utilitarian. But as I mentioned on the prior slide, this is a multi-dimensional choice, right? You have horsepower, miles per gallon, styling, all kinds of other stuff. But let's just imagine a simple world here. And what you can see is that companies, automakers, choose to locate their products as far away from each other as possible in product space and as close to where customer preferences are. And so you can think about differentiated product competition as these little points in space where companies are placing their products to be close to local demand and as far away from each other as possible. Okay, that's a model of differentiated product competition. So wrapping up these slides, the last 5 lessons here, differentiation can be based off intangibles or tangibles. So we saw this with Coke and Pepsi. We call there's a 2 types of differentiation: vertical differentiation, which is based off quality. So here's one: low deductible versus high deductible insurance. We all agree on which one's better, but one's costlier than the other. And then horizontal differentiation is based off consumer taste, such as ginger ale or root beer. And that is a preliminary model of differentiated product competition, and we will return to it next week with Airbus and Boeing. So that sums up the discussion, and we will see you again in class to discuss Airbus and Boeing, and again, differentiated product competition as our opening for our module on competitive dynamics.